Hello, everyone. I am Ann Albert, and I am the Klatt Family Director for Public Programs here at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. We are back after a few weeks away to continue and then complete our year-long series of talks on the theme of canon in context, in which scholars are leading us to think historically about major works of Jewish law. As you already know, if you've been following this series, the topic is aligned with the theme of the research fellowship here at the Katz Center this year, which deals more broadly with Jews and pre-modern law. Our hardy band of researchers have come from around the world to live in Philadelphia and work together under one roof on interconnected studies of the broad contexts in which Jewish law developed and operated from antiquity through the 18th century. So for this public series, we've organized a set of talks in connection with that about pre-modern efforts to compile, codify, or organize the great multiplicity of the Jewish legal tradition over time. So as attendees of past programs have already seen in talks on the Mishnah, the Talmud, Maimonides, and the Shulchan Aruch, these efforts to reshape Jewish law were often bold, sometimes idiosyncratic, and in each case, we've looked at how the authors or compilers thought about their work, how they responded to the changes and perceived needs of their own day. In case you missed those talks, I would direct you to the Katz Center's YouTube channel, where recordings of them are stored in perpetuity, so you can explore them and share them at your leisure. Now, in our final two talks for the series, today and next week at the same time, we are shifting just a little to begin to incorporate aspects of early modern book history into understanding the course of Jewish legal canonization. We'll see that the rise of print, right, the invention of the printing press and its incorporation into Jewish culture was not a neutral force, with printed books merely taking the place of hand-copied manuscripts exactly as they had been created or consumed before. Instead, the new technology of the book had a substantive or qualitative impact on the reception of al-halakha, both in terms of what sources were available to rabbinic thinkers and how the range and diversity of early works was conceived. So we'll be learning a lot more about that. Before we proceed, just a couple of additional things. First, as always, I extend truly my sincere thanks to everyone who makes these programs possible and who attends and sends their feedback. We really appreciate it. My talented colleagues, Becky Friedman, Diana Dennis Walters, and Brian Lipscomb are absolutely indispensable in bringing these programs, excuse me, bringing these programs to fruition, and I cannot thank you enough. I also want to express appreciation to our financial sponsors. These include the Klatt family, the Harry Stern Family Foundation, the Katz family, and other dedicated members of the Center's Board of Advisors. And finally, also the members of the Friends of the Katz Center, which is a circle of donors with particular interest in this kind of programming. So if you are interested in joining that group, we would love to connect with you. And there is, or there will be shortly, a link in the chat. We are grateful for, and we truly admire all of your commitment to supporting scholarship and expanding its reach. Second, I want to acknowledge that we are proceeding today with business as usual at a time that feels very unusual, with Ukraine suffering under a Russian military invasion and many concerned about resulting threats to world order. This catastrophe is very much on our minds, on my mind, especially since not only but also because there is such a long and complex and indeed ongoing history of Jewish life in Ukraine and its wider region. In fact, the talks this week and next address aspects of pre-modern Jewish history that took place in part in Eastern Europe, and both of our speakers happen to be scholars who focus on Eastern European Jewish history. And I note that that fact under ordinary conditions might not occasion much remark. But today, with that region under a microscope, the roles of Jews and Jewish history are particularly prominent. And we continue with these programs, even though they don't address the current situation directly, knowing that in a broader sense, Jewish history matters. Deeper knowledge of the Jewish past informs wider conversations and events and enriches us all. Finally, a reminder or a guide for those who are new about how we will proceed over the next hour or so. In a moment, I'll introduce our speaker and turn things over to him. Once he has completed his presentation, I'll come back and moderate some question and answer. So I encourage you to submit your questions anytime during the course of the presentation. You can do that using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We have quite a few people in the webinar today, about 200 so far. So I usually can't get to all of the questions, but that shouldn't discourage you from submitting them. I try to take a representative sample, and I really do enjoy seeing them and knowing that you all are out there. So do put your questions in the Q&A. All right, with all of that said, no further ado, it is my pleasure truly to introduce Edward Fram, Associate Professor of Jewish History and the Sally Yellen Chair in Eastern European and Lithuanian Jewry at Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Beersheba, Israel. Professor Fram's, hello there, research focuses especially on the history of Jewish law in the early modern period, which we'll hear about, and how it was adapted to face new situations. His books include Ideals Face Reality, Jewish Law and Life in Poland, 1550 to 1655, and My Dear Daughter, Rabbi Benjamin Slonik and the Education of Jewish Women in 16th Century Poland. He has also produced articles on topics as varied as the Jewish law of copyright, the Jewish teaching of local vernaculars in the pre-modern era, and the earliest Hebrew printers in Krakow. He's also written about Jews in Ukraine and the terrible events of 1648. And of course, he has also written about changes to the Talmud page. And that is what he's going to be speaking to us about today as we explore how its iconic layout came to be. So with that, take it away. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. So, share this with you here. So we're going to discuss today. So first, thank you very much for having me, and I'd like to lay out what we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss how the printed page of the Talmud came to be the printed page that we know. So we're talking about designing the page of Talmud and not about necessarily how all the commentators wrote their commentaries or things like that. So let's take a look and see. We have here what you see, the modern printed page of Talmud. This is what you would find in almost any edition of the Talmud that had been printed in the late 20th, early 21st century. There are always some differences, and I'd like to focus on a few things that are on this page. So we'll make the page a little bigger, and you can see that there are a number of different parts to this page that have been set off in different ways. They've been set off using fonts, they've been set off using spaces, and they've been set off using titles. So just to remember, the printed page is really a canonical text now. But this canonical text, like many other canonical texts that we know, didn't start this way. The Talmudic page that we see before us is really a composite of various texts that predated print and additions that were made to it once printing began. Now, the text that we know was created over time and continues to evolve, albeit subtly, but it does still change. So if the printed text is a collated text, then we have to ask a few questions regarding the text itself in our survey. What was included and what was not included? Now, printers don't always tell us why they included something and why they excluded something. So we're going to have to ask a few questions of ourselves. Now, the printing of the Babylonian Talmud began in the 1480s, but it wasn't until the 1520s that the entire text was printed. And not everything that we see on the page before us was printed at that time. So let's look at what we see now on a printed text, and then we'll go back in time and see how it got there. So there's the text. I'm just going to enlarge it. And so you can see what's been highlighted here in green. Well, that's the Mishnah. The Mishnah is edited in the 2nd century by Rabbi Judah the Prince. You can see it's in Hebrew, and that's one part of the Talmud. So the Talmud is composed of the Mishnah, and the second part, which you see highlighted here in red, that's the Gemara. This is material that was composed between approximately 200 CE to around 650 CE. There are all sorts of disputes about when this period ends, but we'll take 650 as a point just for our discussion today. And you can see that although it uses Hebrew characters, it's in a different language. It is a mix of both Hebrew and Aramaic. So our modern page has Mishnah, Gemara, together the Talmud, but it has more. You can see on the sides here, on the right-hand side, you can see commentaries. One commentary is that of Rashi, that's on the right, and on the left, the commentary of the Tosfot. Rabbis who followed Rashi living in the 11th century in France, and in the 12th century into the 13th century, we have rabbis who studied in study halls in northern France and in the German lands, and they're called the Tosfot. Literally, they make additions, they try to make sure that the Talmudic text is harmonized, that there are no contradictions between the Talmudic text, but they are now part of this page that we know. There are other tools here. For example, there's a cross-reference system, and that's what we see here, these little Hebrew letters, and then more text is a cross-reference system throughout the Talmud. There's even more in the page. The underlined blue is a page number, a standardization of the page number. The highlighted lime green are references to legal text, Maimonides, the work of Moses of Kutsi in the 13th century, Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, and as you heard a few weeks ago, the discussion of Shulchan Aruch is also cross-referenced here. All these things were not part of the original Talmud. They found their way to the Talmudic page, and our task is going to have to be, how did they get there, and who put them there? So let's begin our journey as we go through. So here's a page of Talmud. This is only Talmud, though. This manuscript, before the age of print, 13th century France or Germany, is simply a page of Talmud. You notice that there's no commentaries on the side to speak of. There are some corrections. There may be some words that have been missing and somebody's added them in, and maybe someone has suggested a better reading, but it's simply a page of Talmud. Talmud being the Mishnah and the Gemara together, there's nothing more here. And this Vatican manuscript, when we say a Vatican manuscript, this is the manuscript was obviously not compiled in the Vatican, but that's where it's found its place now. So this manuscript represents Talmud. This is the earliest complete manuscript of the Talmud, or almost complete, Munich Hebrew Manuscript 95, Munich Codex, and here again we see the Talmud. But we'll see, we'll enlarge this in a moment, that this too is just the Talmudic text. We have a lot of writing in the middle, we have a few little glosses on the side, nothing too serious, and then we have up in the corners on the right-hand side, we have the Mishnah. But we don't have any commentary. In medieval times, I can't say, since not everything has survived, I can't say with authority the vast majority, but I certainly think the vast majority of texts of the Talmud are only texts of the Talmud. They're not commentaries. There are no commentaries with them. Here's the same text you can see, the text of the Talmud, written across by hand. Obviously, everything here is in hand. And then you have, on the side, you have a Mishnah that it's referring to. But that's the text. There's no help. If you wanted help, you'd need a different manuscript. You'd need Rashi. Rashi, the 11th century commentator who lives in France, really the commentator par excellence, both on the Talmud and on the Hebrew Bible. Here is his commentary. But his commentary, as you can see from this text, is not attached to the Talmud. It's a standalone work. So if I want to study Talmud together with Rashi's commentary, then I'm going to have two manuscripts, the Talmud and Rashi's commentary. Now, in the medieval times, having commentaries or having books, this is not a simple matter. Don't forget, everything here is handwritten, and it's parchment and paper are expensive commodities. This is not something that everyone has access to. So this manuscript of Rashi that's in London is not unique. Here's another one. You can see, again, the text of Rashi as a standalone work. Now, as we go through the Middle Ages and we enter the 15th century, as you know, in the mid-15th century, Gutenberg develops the idea of movable type and print, and this is, of course, quickly adopted by Jews. That's in contradistinction to some other cultures who do not approve of print immediately. Jews seem to take up print very, very quickly. And it's something that they will print. Now, here is an example of a manuscript that has made this adaptation. We have both the Talmudic text and Rashi along the side, but this is a relative rarity. When we come to print, they're there. This is one of the earliest volumes of the Talmud that's printed. This is pre-expulsion Spain in Guadalajara. And here we have the Talmudic text in the center and Rashi's commentary on the outside. Now notice that even though we are in Christian Spain in the 15th century, Rashi is still thought and accepted to be the commentator, and he is included in this work. And here you can see it's blown up a little bit, but let's look at some of the changes that they've made. Here we have the Talmudic text. As you can see here, these are 2 pages, right? And here's the middle. And I have to thank the National Library of Israel for digitizing all this material that we're going to see today. Almost all of it comes from the National Library site, and you too can enter. They're free access. They've scanned many, many, many rare books, Hebrew rare books, and they're available to the public. And that's where I found these. So here we have the text of the Talmud, and you can see that they're using square type, but Rashi has been added, and notice it's been set off using space, but also a different font. Okay, so that's one way of separating between and making it clear to everyone that we're talking about different fonts. We're talking about different commentaries. So here's a little blow up, and you can see square type of the Talmudic text and Rashi. Now this is basically what we call Rashi type. Now, to be clear, Rashi in the 11th century did not write in Rashi type. He did not try to write this way or anything else. This is something that printers developed in the 15th century in order to differentiate 2 different texts, Rashi in its special type and the Talmudic text in the square. For anyone who uses Word, we know this very well. All you have to do is go up to the font section and change the fonts. That's exactly what they did. But remember, these fonts had to be cut by hand in order to be used here in this edition. Now, it wasn't just Rashi that was a commentator that was being used in the age of manuscripts. The Tosfot also began as manuscripts, and that's the way they were passed down. And here you see Tosfot from the town of Sens. This is on Tractate Brachot. And here too, a manuscript of commentary without the text. So now if I wanted to study Tosfot while I was studying Talmud, I needed 3 manuscripts. I needed the Talmudic text, I needed Rashi, and I need Tosfot. So this gets to be quite an expensive ordeal here to try to get this all together. Well, in the late 15th century, Hebrew publishers in the town of Sonsino tried to make this easier for users, and they published the Talmud with both the Talmudic text and both commentaries, those of Rashi and the Tosfot, on the sides of the page. So again, we've essentially taken 3 manuscripts and we've put them all together on 1 page. And that's changing the way people study. Now, we discussed some things are included and some things are not included. there were other canonical texts. Here's an example of the Mishnah with Maimonides' commentary. But where is that going to fit? As you can see, it's not on the page we just discussed. So they put it in the back of this edition. Some things were added to the Talmudic text, but not in the text itself, but rather at the back of the text. And here's one example, and there'll be many more examples. We'll see a few others in a few moments. So there are other canonical texts that exist. There are other important commentaries that exist, but they don't find their way onto the page. They find their way in the back. Now, here's another example of a text, but this is the text of the full Talmud, the first time the full Talmud is printed. This is printed by Daniel Bomberg in Venice in between 1520 and 1523. And here you can see we have the Talmudic text here. Here's the Mishnah. Here is the beginning of the Talmud, of the Gemara. And we have Rashi and we have Tosfot. Now, Bomberg invested huge sums of money to create this entire text of the Talmud. And this is a major, major step forward in Jewish cultural history, because here we have the Talmudic text in a beautiful layout. And if you have an opportunity one time to see an original Bomberg, you should certainly take advantage of it, because it is a beautiful, beautiful text. Fine paper, good text, and this is done in Venice. Ah, yes, one thing we should say, one interesting thing about printers in Venice, Daniel Bomberg being the first. Now, he is not a Jewish person. He is Christian who has an interest in Hebrew publishing, and others will soon join this business because they find out that Jews buy a lot of books. Not a bad investment. Bomberg invests in this. He has other interests as a Hebraist, but Bomberg invests in this work. Bomberg also publishes other things. There are other codes that are available. This is an example of the code of Rabbi Isaac Alfasi, an 11th century jurist who lived in North Africa, as his name suggests, Alfasi from Fez, and later in Muslim Spain. His work was a classic work that was used by all sorts of jurists, and Bomberg publishes it as a separate book, not as a book of Talmud. And here you can see, this is from Tractate Shabbat. This is Alfasi's work here, looking just very much like Talmud. Moreover, you can see this even says this is Rashi. It's not really Rashi. It's a commentary on Alfasi that's very much based on Rashi's work, but it undergone other reworkings. And here is a work by the 15th century Rabbi Nissim of Nissim Gurion. So again, other works, they're available. Bomberg publishes them, people use them, but these works do not make it onto the page that we know. And that's an important point. Bomberg includes other work, publishes other works. This is a legal work by Mordechai ben Hillel, a German jurist of the 13th century. Again, published by Bomberg together with Alfasi's work, but not included in our page of Talmud. Now, Mordechai ben Hillel's work is a standard work of Jewish law and used by many, many people, but it does not find its way to the page of Talmud. Moreover, you can see here at the end, there's a Tosefta. Tosefta, also published by Bomberg in the same volume as Alfasi's work and Mordechai ben Hillel's work, but not included in the Talmudic page. The Tosefta represents material from the 1st and 2nd centuries, parallel to the Mishnah, but work that was not edited into the Mishnah. Nobody wanted to throw that out. Nobody wanted to ignore it. They wanted to use it in their study. But the size of the page is limited, and they had to make editorial choices. One did not study Tosefta in order to understand the Talmud better, or at least most people didn't. You needed commentaries to help one understand the Talmud. Rashi was a sine qua non. Tosfot, well, that's debatable. Now, just because we're into the age of print, I want to point out there are no photocopying machines. So there are still manuscripts of Talmud floating around, and people copy them, particularly off In the East, this piece from Yemen is a text of Talmud. And you can see here, they don't seem to have Rashi. They seem to be continuing with the standard Talmudic manuscript, and that will go on in some places for quite a while. But print will conquer. Now, Rashi is not the only commentator on the Talmud. This is the work of Rabbi Solomon ibn Adret. Rabbi Solomon ibn Adret, living in 13th century Christian Spain, writes a commentary on the Talmud. But his commentary does not find its way to the page of Talmud. His commentary is printed again by Daniel Bomberg in 1523 as a separate book. So one has to ask oneself, why does Rashi's text and the Tosfot text find their way to the Talmudic page, but yet the work of Solomon ibn Adret does not? Rashi's text helps one study the Talmud independently. It's the building block for understanding. He explains words, phrases. Before Rashi even put his pen to paper, he studied the Talmudic text. He knew where the Talmudic discussion was going, and he writes his commentary to help us reach that understanding. This work doesn't do that. It becomes a standalone work. It's a commentary that some people will be interested, some people will learn, but it is not printed on the page of the Talmud. So as time goes on, you can see we're moving now into the middle of the 16th century, and the Talmudic page is very similar to that Talmudic page that Daniel Bomberg published in Venice. But there's a lot more scribbling in the margins here. As time went on, publishers want to convince people, you should buy my product. Why should I buy a copy of your new Talmud if I already have an old Talmud? I have Daniel Bomberg's Talmud. Why should I buy a new one? As you can see, the printer of this is not Daniel Bomberg, but rather Marcus Giustiniani. Giustiniani has to convince people, my edition is better. It has something that you don't have. It's worth investing. So let's take a look at some of those things he's added to the sides of the page here, because we still have the same Talmud, we still have Rashi, we still have the Tosfot, but there are additions here that might make it worthwhile to invest in this new venture. So here's our page, and you notice these little markings on the side here. This is a cross-referencing system. Giustiniani, again a non-Jew, paid Jews to help improve his product. Part of improving the product is cross-referencing. Cross-referencing to the Tosefta that we mentioned. Cross-referencing to other passages of the Talmud that may be mentioned. This is a boon to anyone who's going to use the Talmud. Because if I study, one of the interesting things of studying Talmud is there are many, many cross or parallel sections of the Talmud. I want to know those parallel sections because a parallel section may help me understand the section I'm studying right now. Giustiniani's addition added these to the side, and that was something very helpful to users. Now, not everyone followed in Giustiniani's way. There were people, again, here's only 2 years later, who said, I have to do something also. So Cornelius Edelkin publishes the Talmud in Sabonieta in 1553, and he decides he has to do something that's going to convince people to buy his copy. And he does a few interesting things that are worth looking at, not all of which get picked up by others. Now, anyone who's ever looked at a page of Talmud knows that one of the daunting things about studying Talmud is there's no punctuation, no periods, no commas, no semicolons. So how are you supposed to know how to read this page? Well, this 1553 edition had an ingenious idea. You see, this is the Mishnah. And you can see underneath these words, there are markings. You can see, I'm trying to point out, I hope you can see it on your screen, but there are a number of markings. And if you look at these markings, you will say, well, those markings look a little familiar. Sorry that I went up that page. Those markings look a little familiar. And if you said that, you're correct. Those are markings that are the cantillation marks that we see in the Hebrew Bible, whether it be in the 5 books of Moses or whether it be in other books of the Bible. cantillation marks were added to help people read it. This edition of the Mishnah adds cantillation marks. Now, the cantillation marks, I'm not sure that it was meant to be sung, but one thing for certain is cantillation marks are a form of punctuation. It tells you when to pause, when to stop, and that's was added to the Mishnah here. And throughout this edition of the Talmud, this tractate of the Talmud, he only published this one tractate, he added cantillation marks to help read. Wow, that's a reason to buy this text. He added a few other things as well. If you look on the side, we don't just have Tosfot. We have a few other additions. We have an additional Tosfot here, called Tosfot Arid, but no less important, probably even far more important, we have here a commentary of Rabbi Yom Tov Ibn Ashvili, a 13th century commentator who wrote a commentary on this tractate of Kedushin, and his commentary has been added, so you're getting extra value. Now, the extra value for your book means that this is a reason that I should go out and buy a new edition. Bomberg is not enough. The new edition is helpful. Needless to say, this is obviously an additional expense for people, for the printer to put this together. Now, he adds a few other things. He is not the first, but he makes it much neater. Cross-referencing. There's more cross-referencing on the side here. Here are references to Maimonides. Now, when I studied the Talmud text and I want to know where I could find this law in a code of law, I now have cross-referencing to Maimonides, telling me specifically what section of Maimonides' Mishnah Torah is being referred to, where I can find this discussion in the Talmud in other places. Moreover, it includes Moshe ben Kutsi's Sefer Mitzvot Gadol and the reference to Jacob ben Asher's 14th century tour. Now, this is going to become a very important reference because, as you heard in your discussion, in the discussion of Shulchan Aruch that was presented by Professor Gray a few weeks ago, the tour used a certain form, a novel form of organization that was totally adapted by Joseph Caro in his 16th century Shulchan Aruch. So, Shulchan Aruch hasn't been published yet, but these reference systems will become very, very helpful very, very soon. Now, as we move across, we discussed that some things are included and some things are not included. Here we've moved into Eastern Europe, and Hebrew publishing moves into Eastern Europe in the 16th century, and in the 17th century, at least until 1648, Eastern Europe is a center of Hebrew publishing. 1648 will be a bit of a break. It'll come back again into the 18th century, but here is Tractate Ketubot, Krakow, 1616, 1620. And we see that here something is missing. Here we have the text of the Talmud, and we have Rashi, but there's no Tosfot here. Now, this is an interesting thing, that the Tosfot has been removed from this text, and this is the only full, to the best of my knowledge, the only full text of the Talmud without Tosfot printed in it, once Tosfot had become part of the standard formatting. Now, why was this done? Well, let's go back a little earlier, a few years earlier. You may remember that the Maharal of Prague, who lived the late 16th century, early 17th century, was very much opposed to students studying Tosfot. He thought that the Tosfot study of the Tosfot was really just too convoluted. And people would be better served if they studied, particularly students would be better served if they studied Rashi with the Talmud, and that was the basis. Another possibility, and not unrelated, is that this edition of the Talmud was essentially meant for students. Beginners didn't need the Tosfot. So why publish the entire set of Tosfot, which again, given manual setting of time, is a major, major investment? Maybe it could be made more simple by just including the text of the Talmud together with Rashi. Notice, however, that there is still remnants of the past here. Here we have a page number, we have page references. You don't want to lose standardization of pagination. because cross-referencing depends upon standardization. Even though the pagination of this text is different because Tosfot is not there, you still want to be able to go back and refer to other places. So the original pagination is still mentioned. And here you see a little larger print. So that's one thing. On the side, you can see they also kept the cross-referencing. That's crucial. So the cross-referencing is also kept in this edition, and students would be very appreciative of that. So that's here as well. Now, this sort of printing the Talmud without Rashi, without Tosfot, did not go on for long. Here you could see again, Krakow, or soon back again with Rashi, Tosfot, and other things. But here there's some other things that are added. And here you can see pretty similar. On the side, we still have this reference system. So here we're going to blow this up a little bit and get a better sense of our references here. So here on the side again, we have references to Maimonides, to his Mishnah Torah, his Code of Jewish Law. Time and again, these become standard parts of a Talmudic work. Now, did everyone do this? Was everyone interested? Or what happens if we go back to the East? Are we totally in an Ashkenazic world frame setting? What did they include in the East? In the East, in Constantinople, many of the things were also included. Here again, we have Rashi, Tosfot, and the Talmudic text in the middle. These things seem to have conquered it. But printing by its very nature, and I include at the end, I'm going to give a little bibliography, and one of the things I'm going to include in the bibliography is a video from Cambridge University Libraries about the printing press in the 16th century. Setting type by hand wasn't a simple thing to do. It wasn't just that I had to call out each letter to the typesetter, say, give me a mem, give me an aleph, give me a yud. The type also had to be set in reverse, because remember, when I type something, I'm going to print it. It has to be reversed so that it'll come out cleanly. Mistakes creep in. And here's an example. In the same Constantinople edition, you can see that many of the things of the earlier editions were included, but users had to be wary and say, whoops, there are a lot of typos here. Typos are become one of the major cultural problems of the 16th century with the printing of the Talmud. Users start using it and they say, here's a typo here, here's a typo there. Even though Daniel Bomberg employed people to try to correct, and others did as well, Bomberg employed really very highly capable people, but the workload was unbelievable. And culturally speaking, one of the things that becomes part of Talmudic culture, study culture in the 16th century or into the beginning of the 17th century is making corrections. And this Constantinople edition includes at the end commentary of Rabbi Solomon Luria. It's not a commentary, I correct that. It's his glosses on the printed Talmud, in which he makes all sorts of corrections. It's sort of like an errata list at the end. It's not exactly the same, but they're aware that there are all sorts of problems in the printed text. And many, many people take it upon themselves to try to correct these things. And corrections will become part of the modern text as well. This constantly try to improve the text. That doesn't mean that they're always going back to manuscripts. Very often they realize it's a mistake just from their own study of Talmud. They realize that doesn't sound right. That word is wrong. This is misspelled. Letters have been inverted. Wrong term. They make corrections. One of the other things that we find in this Constantinople edition is printing also had some technical problems. While Bomberg did a great job of setting the type, making perfect layout, the Talmud, particularly Rashi's commentary on it, has diagrams. But Bomberg didn't print the diagrams. For whatever reason, he was unable to get the diagrams into the print, and he left open spaces where diagrams belonged. In the course of this user using the Talmud, he found, hey, I can fill in some of these things. And you can see that these diagrams that are included here are hand-drawn. The user of this particular volume of the Talmud seems to be quite learned, and he drew these things in himself. Here's another example. You can see, if you doubt that whether these are hand-drawn, you can see these circles are not perfect. So over the course of time, even though we have a printed text, there were certain things left out of the printed text, and users included them later as they use these texts. Now, as time went on, the Talmudic text continued to be printed, and here we're at the late 17th century. Well, we're talking about the Masechet Brachot, and this is a well-financed text. Here you can see again, this is not just Jews have a hand in this, but let's look at text here, what we see, and see where this is taking us. So again, here we have the Talmudic text. It's printed. You can see it's quite nicely done. It has that around the beginning of the Mishnah, it has a framework, and again, we have Rashi, we have Tosfot, we have Talmudic text, and you'll notice this numbering here. I'll blow this up in a moment so you can look at it. Here we have the numbering. We also have cross-references to citations from biblical texts. That's been added. And we have the letter Aleph here is referring us to the side, again, to Maimonidean references or to codes. Here again is a reference to the tour of Jacob ben Asher. So again, these are numbered to ease use. Now this numbering that we see here in this late 17th century edition carries over to this very day. And that's something we found in our text. We looked at the modern page, that these things had carried over into the modern text. And here you see it's blown up just to make it a little easier to see. Number on the side, reference on the other side. Here's our modern page again. You see the number, Aleph, here it is, right here. We've moved it off to the side, up on the top, making it cleaner. The cross-referencing, here it is up here. It's all been moved up to the side instead of being along the sides of the page. The citations from biblical passages, over here on the right, added in again. So all these things have been incorporated, and some things that have been found in manuscript or in other prints have been added to the page as well. But what we see from all this is that the Talmudic page that began as just a page of Talmud in the period of manuscripts, the advent of print allowed for additions. Rashi, Tosfot, from manuscripts. But once we started using Rashi and Tosfot and the Talmudic page, in the age of print, certain things were added to the page. The cross-referencing system became useful. That gets added in. That's not to be found in the manuscript period. That's an addition of print. So the canonical page that we know in the modern period has taken from the past and added even from what was modern. Now, I've added a few things here for further reading if you're interested more in the history of the printing of the Talmud. The most famous and important work is actually in Hebrew. That's by Fram Netta Rabinovitz, Ma'amar al-Hadpasat Talmud. I'll add some English things in a moment, but I raise this here as a possibility. There's a YouTube video, and even though it says utu.be, I know that's not how YouTube is spelled. I did double check it. This is the link that works. You'll see a short video from Cambridge University Library regarding printing in the very early period, in the 15th century, and they'll help understand some of the difficulties of printing such a text as the Talmud, which is a very large text, different size fonts, and the work involved in binding such material, all that you get a sense of in a short video. And here's some further material in English. Printing the Talmud from Baumberger to Schottenstein is a collected volume that has a number of essays regarding the printing of the Talmud and how things get added, who adds them to the Talmud, what are the issues. Neil Natano's book From Maimonides to Microsoft, The Jewish Law of Copyright from the Birth of Print, does not deal as much with the Talmudic text, but some of the disputes involved as people add material. People say, well, I added material, you shouldn't be able to copy that. So that's an interesting discussion from the perspective of modern law as well. We see that the idea of copyright is not so modern. It's been around for a while. And finally, Marvin Heller's book, Printing the Talmud, is a very useful survey for the different editions of the Talmud that have been printed and the earlier editions, and it gives much information, pictures and summaries of the various editions that will help add to the discussion we've had today. So thank you very much for sharing and for having me, and I hope that we've been able to discuss some of the issues involved with creating this canonical text.
Thank you so much. That was just absolutely fascinating. We have a number of questions, and I have to say the quality of the questions today is just really high. So I'm going to do my very best to sort of group them and bring as much as I can to this conversation. So the first kind of set of questions that I'm seeing involves thinking about the editorial process on the part of those first printers or publishers. So we have people asking questions like, who chose or how did they choose which Tosafot to include on the page? Who were the people behind those decisions, right? Especially if the printer was non-Jewish, was he imagining a Jewish readership or a non-Jewish readership, and were there experts in Jewish law or in Jewish commentarial traditions who were informing those decisions? How did that happen, especially in the early days? I think that let's start there.
Okay, so the question is well taken, because essentially in the Guadalajara edition, we just had Talmud and Rashi. That makes sense. But what the Sonsino family did was, yes, the people who did that printing, even though the family didn't originate in Sonsino, when they were living there, eventually they took on the name Sonsino. And Gershon Sonsino stands out, Yoshua Sonsino as well. These people decided, look, we want to add the Tosfot because that seems to be what's typically studied in a yeshiva. They study Rashi, Tosfot, and the Talmud. And he went around northern Italy searching for manuscripts of Tosfot. Now, in some ways, it was a bit of a chance. What did he find? So he found various manuscripts, and those are the Tosfot that he added. There are other parallel Tosfot that he did not include. We don't know in every case whether he had choice A, B, and C, and he chose A. He may have only had A, or he may have only have had C. But one of the interesting things is if we study the Talmud, the Tosfot come from various schools. And if you look, for example, the work of Ephraim Auerbach, who was a scholar at the Hebrew University, he tried to figure out, so who is the author of each Tosfot? And in the back of his book on the Balei Tosfot, he has a listing of the various authors, the schools they came from. And so that's how these Tosfot found their way to the page. Could there have been other Tosfots chosen? There certainly could have. Now, when Bomberg took on the task, he knew that he couldn't do this, and he hired the head of the rabbinic court in Venice to help him proofread all this. Now, this is an amazing task. This man had to proofread the entire Talmud, Rashi, Tosfot, and Rav Isaac Alfasi and all this other material within 3 or 4 years of work. That's one reason that there are some mistakes. You can't really, it's just an amazing undertaking. But he had a whole group of Jews working for him. The Venetian government wouldn't allow Jews to own a press. Bomberg owned the press. He didn't do the footwork. He hired Jews to do this for him, and they did the proofreading, and this is true of Justiniani as well. And just to take a little step out of Talmud, if we move to the printing of the Mishnah Torah in the 1550s, we have 2 competing printing houses, and Jews are working for both of them. And this is thought to cause, of course, a dispute. This is an oversimplification. The dispute between these 2 houses leads in part to the edict to burn the Talmud, because there are those who say that they went and complained to the Pope about this. So Jews are very much involved in these processes.
Okay, and that actually anticipated a couple of other questions that had come up, one of which was asking about variation in or text for the Tosfot. So I think one kind of follow-up question then is, did subsequent different printers use the Bamberg selection of texts and pass on a version of that or text, or did other people source different versions? In other words, did the variation in manuscripts also inform a variation in print version? And when and how did that become standardized across versions?
So essentially, Sonsino standardized the Tosfot that we call Tosfot, so to speak. Bamberg picked up on that, and it continued. There may be some examples of some people who were informed by manuscript. I don't know of that. But these parallel Tosfot have become an industry in the late 20th century. And that's what many people do. They try to find the manuscripts. And so we have these parallel Tosfot. Some people still have the parallel Tosfot in manuscript. But to the best of my knowledge, there's nobody who replaces the Tosfot that have been printed.
All right. Related, unrelated question. So a couple of people are asking about the printing of the Jerusalem Talmud. Was it also printed early, and does it have a similar history?
So the Jerusalem Talmud has a poorer history. Daniel Bamberg did print it. He did indeed. In the 1520s, he printed the Jerusalem Talmud, but it is only the text of the Mishnah and the Talmud, nothing more. There are no commentaries. There are a few little cross-references or corrections, but it's just the text of the Talmud. In the early 17th century, David Hadarshan, who was somebody who had studied in Eastern Europe, had gone to Italy and then came back to Eastern Europe, he printed the Talmud, in the Jerusalem Talmud, in Krakow, and he added a commentary. There's a question of is his commentary or not, but that's about it. The Jerusalem Talmud doesn't really get picked up on, and the commentaries that are around the traditional Jerusalem Talmud that one might find today in a bookstore or in a library, those are not, with all due respect to their authors, and I say this with all due respect, these are not in the category of Rashi.
And does that reflect the existing habits of study of the two Talmuds?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. All right, so there's a kind of a another set of questions having to do with understanding where this basic format of the columns and the surrounding texts may have derived from. Who was using it? What did it mean? What was the sort of cultural significance of using such a format? So one attendee has suggested that it appeals to humanism, or buying into humanist culture on the part of Bamberg. Another is asking if you agree with the theory that this format copied Christian manuscripts of a particular variety. So can you talk about sort of that whole question?
Well, so first of all, just to take a little different order, but Bamberg didn't introduce that. As you saw, as the picture of Sonsino, this already was introduced before. And if we go back further into manuscripts, we have Hebrew manuscripts from the Middle Ages. As you saw also, you have a Talmudic text and you have Rashi on the side. Moreover, we have other manuscripts, Hebrew manuscripts in the Middle Ages, that also have this canonical text in the middle, commentaries on the side. Now, to go back to the question, did Jews in the Middle Ages copy this from Christians? That's a good question, but I don't know enough about manuscript transmission in the Middle Ages to answer that question. But I will agree, this is very, very similar to things we see in Christian culture. Again, canonical text in the middle, commentaries on the side. We see this in canon law. We see this in Roman law. If you look at a Roman law text, I'm trying to think of a manuscript in particular, but let's say certainly in the 15th century, but I think in the 14th century as well, I've seen exactly what it looks like. Text in the middle, commentaries are on the side. You say, oh my goodness, this is Talmud in Latin. But clearly it's not. But I can't say where it began.
So when that entered into the Jewish print tradition, right, that now I think most Jews who look at it would do as you did and say, oh, it looks like the Talmud, right? Whereas it doesn't feel like the same thing has been preserved in Christian print culture, but maybe that's not the case for the 15th, 16th, 17th century print culture.
Right. So again, in print culture, at the beginning of print culture, so you can find Bibles that will have a Bible in the middle and commentaries around the side, and you can find a little bit. I'm trying to remember if I can think of something in Roman law, but in Roman law you might also find it, but it doesn't last for long. And that's really the difference. In Jewish law, it seems to get canonized.
Right. It's fascinating. So along those lines, there are some questions about the aspect of canonization that involves standardization. And there's sort of two things connected to that. One is, can you talk a little more, I think you mentioned it to some extent, a little more about the effort to standardize pagination and cross-referencing. So today, right, we refer to pages of the Talmud by a page number. So is that from Bomberg? And how did that come about? Like, did other people basically sign on to copying that original format?
Yes, so it does come from Bomberg, and yes, other people signed on, and that's in the Krakow edition that I showed where there was no Tosfot. They still thought that they had to maintain that pagination possibility, so that you have that little cross-reference on the side of the page, so that people can always go back and, oh, there's a reference to page 26. Well, what's page 26? Even if you're not going to keep up with the Bomberg pagination, you still need the Bomberg pagination to be able to keep cross-referencing. Now, in Maimonides, for example, in Mishnah Torah, you don't have to do that, because Maimonides is organized based on a book, right? He calls the book, say, of Judges, chapter 6, right? Section 2. So go look in chapter 6, section 2. The pagination is irrelevant. It's in the Talmud that it becomes relevant. Now, what did they do before pagination? So, for example, Rashi will talk about chapter. He doesn't have a chapter number. He just calls what's the name of the chapter. But pagination helps a lot more than that. Unless you have photographic memory, somebody says it's in chapter that is called, for example, Hakira. What are you going to go find? You have to go search through it in your mind. So the pagination really was important, and there were some small differences, but they almost always try to keep up with that pagination.
It really does enable a different kind of mutuality in talking about text. I mean, I think today people have the experience of that, right? If there's a reference to something within a long web page that doesn't have pages within it, right? It's like a scroll, and you can't easily find your place. You have to scan for.
But they didn't have Control F.
Right, exactly. So on the other side of the canonization piece, were there reactions among some Jews to this process saying, you know, who has the right to, why do you have the right to decide what goes onto this page? Or Talmud should not be studied this way. We ought to remain within a world of a single manuscript per book, right? Was there controversy associated with this? You told us that print was adopted very quickly, but was there pushback? Was there concern about this innovation?
So I don't know of pushback against the institution of print. Right? There was a pushback against the printing of the Tosfot. As I mentioned, the Maharal of Prague was against the study of Tosfot, but there wasn't someone who said we should not make these books available. Moreover, we know Yitzchak Yudalov, who's a scholar in the National Library in Jerusalem, has written about the printing of the Talmud for study by youngsters. I won't say children, but by youngsters. Cheaper editions, this was used as an educational tool. And just to make a comparison, the Catholic Church was not a big fan of print until all of a sudden they realized, wow, we could control the print press. And then they realized we could print the prayer books. So then they said, okay, it's okay, we can control. On the other hand, Islam was against the use of print. And they outlawed print for a very long time with very, very great negative ramifications for their society. All of a sudden, the Christian world, which was a backwater, moved forward much more quickly with the advent of print. Humanism, remember, these people are books that are printed in Italy, not just Hebrew books, obviously, right? Books printed in Italy, France, other places, they move around, knowledge moves. Copernicus, when he printed his ideas about the earth and the sun, that didn't just stay in one place.
We should be out of time, but I want to squeeze one last question in, if I may. It's a question about usage of these books. How many volumes would have been in a typical set of like a Bomberg printed Talmud? How much did it cost? Who could have one? How did it fit into a kind of culture of Talmud study that existed? You know, was there one for a big library? Was it only a few rich people? Can you just give us a sense of
So just quickly, so we don't know always know the exact runs, but we're talking probably in the 750 to 1250. That's usually what a run would be. It takes a few years to print an entire set of Talmud. This is not something that could be done at the push of a button. This is a big investment, and Bomberg had major financial problems. Now, for purchasers, at the beginning, just as any new product today, the new product can be more expensive than the old product. And it appears that at the beginning of print may have been more expensive than a manuscript. But as time went on, the price fell, and eventually print was used, as we saw in one example here, for education in classrooms. Use cheaper paper, use cheaper fonts, use other things or ways of cutting costs. How many people had copies of the Talmud is a good question. We don't know because, of course, one of the big problems was what happened in the second half of the 16th century in Italy. And when you get the burning of the Talmud, that skews what we know. But there is constantly a demand, right? The people's libraries had to be given over to the church and they were confiscated and burned, so we don't know. But we know that the Talmud is not a rare thing. People don't complain that or not. But to go back to something we began today's with the introduction, between 1648 and 1700, we know that in Eastern Europe, for example, after the events of 1648, there was the dearth of Talmud, and that volume of Talmud we saw that was printed in Frankfurt am Oder, the Jewish community of Krakow begged David Oppenheimer, the rabbi of Prague, who we'll hear about next week from Josh Teplitsky, they begged him to send copies. He said, our copies are all used. They're falling apart. We don't have copies of Talmud. Please send us copies. So times and circumstances could change things.
Amazing. Well, thank you for that perfect segue to next week's lecture. We will be hearing about that world of collectors and publishers who were creating a kind of a market and world of accumulation of Jewish books. I can't thank you enough for being with us today. This was really, really wonderful. And I think just some people were asking if we could post the links that you shared. We will try to do that in the when we post this video on YouTube. We'll try to put the links down below and coordinate that. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you very much for having me.
We wish you the best.